welcome to an interview by the Harvard Political Review. This is Wael Nawara, activist, writer, and co-founder of Egypt's Ghad Party, and he's currently a Spring 2012 Fellow at the Institute of Politics. So, as an activist and as the co-founder of a political party, how have you sought to develop the organizational capacity and the base of support to compete successfully with more established organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood?
Right. At the time when we founded the party, it was around 2003. Our main competitor at that time, our main goal was not the Muslim Brothers. Our main competitor at the time, or our main goal, was to actually bring down the regime. So most of our capacity building were geared towards that end. So we wanted to bring about change, and the way to bring change was to get people to start thinking differently. So we spent a lot of effort in trying to get young people and give them our message that Egypt deserves better and that it's their future that's at stake, and they have to take matters into their own hands. So one of the important things was the training of young people, recruiting of young people, but also in designing political messages of hope, of change, because I think after about 25 years of Mubarak, at that time, Mubarak has been in power for 25 years, so the biggest problem we faced was the apathy. A lot of people actually had lost hope of change. We also went through elections in 2005 and after, so we also tried to build our organizational capacity to be able to run campaigns. But because we had very few resources, so we sort of designed our training also for the people to be able to use alternative resources. So maybe look for parallel solutions, look for parallel media, whether it's the emails, whether it's the blogs, which were starting to emerge in 2005, whether it's Facebook. We started, the Ghad Party changed the nature of Facebook in Egypt. When our newspaper was shut down in 2007, we went to Facebook. At that time, we had only about 90,000 people, and was mostly used for social purposes. We turned totally political, so we had like political groups on Facebook, and within 6 months, or almost 8 months, in April 2008, we had some of our members staging the first general strike in Egypt, which is known as April 6 movement.
How have things changed now after the revolution in terms of the political climate, and what do you recommend to the new generation who are now seeking a voice in politics?
I think that the revolution is not complete yet. It's still work in progress, and the reason for that is that in January and after January 2011, we managed to remove Mubarak, but the regime still, in many parts, still is there. So I think the next stage for revolutionaries is to get organized into political parties or perhaps even alliances. People should let behind or should set aside their differences, ideological differences, and realize that the revolution needs their united efforts, just like what happened in January 2011. I think the next step would be for people to get organized in order to start being involved in things like elections. So I would advise people to go into two directions. One direction is to continue the revolution through political pressure from the movement itself, which does not necessarily need to be organized into parties. But the second parallel path, which also should be taken, is to get organized into political parties and movements so that they can actually run in elections and win seats as to become influential in Egyptian politics.
Mm-hmm. And with the U.S.'s traditional involvement in Egypt and its ongoing military aid, do you think that the United States could play a potentially constructive role in encouraging political transition from military rule without discrediting or compromising these efforts in the process?
To many activists, the U.S. position is not very clear. Many activists believe that the U.S. is somehow supporting the military in Egypt, and in fact many draw parallels with Pakistan and think that perhaps the United States wants to have something similar to what happened in Pakistan, that you have more or less the army controls politics, behind the scenes, and reliance on the Islamist political parties and so on, and political movements to provide the political arm for that military rule. So I'm not sure if the United States is wholeheartedly on one, purpose on this issue. But if the United States wanted to help, I think the first thing it would need to do is to really come back and support principles in general, and show that in every arena. So, for example, in the United Nations, in Security Council, people look at the United States and accuse the United States of double standards when it comes to things like the Palestinian issue. For example, membership of Palestine in the UNESCO. People were shocked to see the United States trying to block that. I think the biggest help that the United States can give to the cause of democracy is for the United States is to stick by its own principles, the principles that it self-advertises, that it self-proclaims, that the United States should stick to these principles in every situation and not selectively choose from this and that, because people at the end of the day come back and say, this is a double standards. The United States says it's supporting democracy, but it doesn't support democracy in other instances and so on. So it weakens, in a way, its influence.
And you mentioned the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I was wondering first how important that issue is to the Egyptian people, and second, what position you think the current regime and future Muslim Brotherhood and other groups in power will take on this issue, and how much they're likely to maintain Egypt's current policy of peace with Israel as opposed to taking a more assertive or confrontational stance.
First, we have to realize that Palestine and Israel, they are the eastern gateway to Egypt. They are on the eastern borders. So, to us, they are very important. This is a very important and strategic position. Secondly, we have to also realize the sort of affinity and the emotional bond that Egyptians would have to Palestinians. As you find here in the United States and many other places, you find a lot of people relating and identifying with the suffering of others. So especially if those others are your neighbors. So having said that, I think that Egyptians have made it clear that they are pro a peaceful and non-violent resolution to the issue, which means that we've seen throughout the last maybe 60 years that conflicts, whether in Iraq or Afghanistan or Palestine, Israel, and so on, has not managed to solve any crisis, any issue. On the contrary, you go and send some troops or start a violent confrontation somewhere, you create more enemies, you complicate things more blood is shed, so things are even more difficult to resolve. So I think, on one hand, Egyptian people believe that it is time that this Palestinian suffering is resolved, that the Palestinian rights are restored, that Israel must be answerable, just like any other state and any other nation should be answerable to the same set of rules that should govern international legitimacy. We believe that it is our role also in the United Nations and in the international community to make sure that we build this sort of coalition of nations to demand that this issue is resolved peacefully. So I would recommend and highly urge the Israeli people to urge their government to respond favorably to these demands and these vows which have been taken almost 35 years ago, and today they are still to be met.
Mm-hmm. And domestically in Egypt, with the current crisis in Egypt's economy, do you believe that the regime, whether the SCAF and the military or the Muslim Brotherhood and its coalition, have the vision and the capacity to move forward and to make the necessary reforms?
Well, one of the things I wrote about a lot is the idea of the parallel state, and that Egypt as a country, because it's a very old country, so Egypt is much bigger than its administration, much bigger than its formal economy, or the part of the economy which the state controls or even sees. So I would say that Egypt does not have any serious economic problem other than that it needs to extend opportunity to more people around the country. The Egyptian economy has very solid foundation, and that in fact the informal sector, which has always been regarded with suspicion and sometimes with contempt, I think is very important for Egypt. Of course, it's important to integrate voluntarily that informal economy in the formal economy, but that in fact requires democracy, and that's the essence of democracy. You have a government which can take into account the interests of all people, not just the wealthy, not just the affluent, but all people must be integrated, because at the end of the day, politics is about the economy. Politics is about the way that the wealth is created and distributed. Who is creating wealth and who is consuming goods, and at what price, and so on and so forth. That's the essence of the political question. That's the essence of the economic question also. So I think it's the current government and next governments and coming governments should realize that Egyptians at the end of the day, just like anybody else, they want to have good lives, they want to produce for their family, they want to provide for their family. So the situation is to try to encourage people to work, encourage people to start businesses, encourage private and collective initiative, and that's the essence of a government, is to try to remove the barriers and remove the leashes which are actually suffocating the Egyptian economy. So I think the success of any future government is to unleash that potential in the Egyptian economy and realize that there are 85 million Egyptians who want to produce, who want to consume, who want to send their kids to school, who want to buy food and clothing and shelter for their families. That in essence, that's the basis that future government should build upon.
And you've mentioned the new constitution. What do you expect will be produced by the current parliament? And do you think that this will be representative of what would be best for Egypt, in your opinion?
Right. I personally think that the parliament which is there now does not have represents the organized people who ran. Does not really represent, just like any other country. The parliament does not necessarily always represent, everybody. But especially in Egypt, where we had a regime, which we had two parties. We had the NDP, the ruling party, the National Democratic Party, and we had the Muslim Brothers, more or less. So once they scrapped the NDP and banned the NDP, so in effect, he had a de facto monopoly by the Muslim Brothers. So there are many other sectors of the Egyptian society which are not represented in this parliament. Now it's up to the parliament today to decide whether it would really go for consensus or whether it will pretend that it actually represents the people and just choose people who are loyal to the existing parliament, although they know, and we know, and that's why we opposed this roadmap, because we knew that this roadmap would produce this unproportional representation. So if they choose consensus, that means that they will bring out people from the young revolutionaries, from the syndicates, from various segments of the Egyptian society, and appoint them in the committee which will be entrusted to write the constitution. If they do that, that would be great. Include everybody in that process and bring a constitution which describes the mind of the collective mind of the Egyptian people. But there is another possibility, which I hope they don't take, that they would take advantage of their temporary majority and their temporary, control of the parliament. In this case, I think it would be a very sad situation, and I think would be pushed back to, having more and more confrontations in the future, because that eventually that constitution will not represent the Egyptian identity. I hope that they will take the first track, which is like try to write a constitution including all the people of Egypt, including all the diversity that Egypt encompasses and holds, and write a constitution which describes the true collective mind and conscience of the Egyptian people. Otherwise, I think would be that constitution simply would be open for disputes and amendments in the future.
Thank you so much for speaking to me today, and I really appreciate you sharing your insights
Thank
on
you,
this
Elsa.
process in Egypt's unfinished and hopefully moving forward revolution.
Thank you, Elsa. It's a
Thank you
pleasure
so
to speak to you. Thank you.